So today's satsang is going to focus on acceptance. Acceptance is acceptance of what is. What acceptance means is really not finding yourself psychologically attached, involved in what is happening. Meaning, doesn't mean that you won't find yourself biologically involved, that you won't be functioning to take part in the circumstance itself. However, what it means is that your identity is not involved, identified, attached with what is happening, and in particular, the outcomes. We could say that whatever is happening is an outcome, moment after moment after moment. But usually there is the flow of life and then a specific outcome or a specific occurrence. In a conversation, for example, someone might say something as part of the conversation, and we can call that part where they insult you, let's say, the outcome. So witnessing is the state of finding an internal quietness, an internal peace with whatever is happening. So this acceptance is not a conceptual, I accept what is happening. It is an acceptance that is beyond accepting or non-acceptance as an intellectual concept. It is the quiet witnessing without being disturbed of whatever is happening, the flow of life, the pleasure or the pain. Now, this witnessing is really something that sets in once the involvement that is so common in life falls away. So we don't actually do witnessing. A shift happens in the system where the involvement, the attachment to outcomes, and hence the suffering that arises when the outcomes are not in line with our preferences, starts to weaken. And as that weakens, there is the potential to drop back into an aspect of the human being that exists prior to any ideas of this is good or this is bad, exists even independent of the actual pleasure and pain of the moment. Now, to try and demonstrate and illustrate this, I'm going to do what I've done on a couple of these satsangs, and I'm hoping it can be quite powerful to talk about different teachings and how they use a methodology to bring about this shift that I'm talking about, a shift outside of attachment to the pleasure and pains of life. The attachment to the pleasure and pains of life is really a byproduct of the psychological identity that is set in place by life based on a very particular combination of your genes and up-to-date conditioning that has put in place an identity that believes. This word believes is very important. An identity that is actually constructed of thought, belief. I am this. Primarily, I am this physical body, the person. And what I need in order to be happy, to be complete, to not be attacked in life is pleasure, 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 pleasure. And it has its list of specific pleasures that are important to this particular psychological identity. And along with the identity of attachment to outcomes, there is embedded in this belief system of who we are the identity that not only am I this person, but I am a separate, independent entity that has complete free will and volition and acts of its own independent free will. That everything that it thinks, everything it says, everything it does is its doing. It as a separate, independent entity, insulated and unaffected by anything else. So this description, insulated and unaffected by anything else, is the projection, the idea that this belief has about itself, which allows it to see itself as an autonomous, independent entity with complete volition. Meaning a choice that happens, a decision that gets made, which in actual fact is a mechanical function based on the circumstance at hand and the body's design. That's what a decision is. It's just a biological happening. It's impersonal. However, this psychological identity looks at the decision and says, I made that decision. So the one saying, I made it, is a belief. The thing that actually made it is the biological instrument that the human being is, designed by life in a very, very complex way, and we're all functioning in a very complex way, but it's not our doing, it's an automatic functioning. This psychological belief in personal doership claims ownership over something that it didn't do, because it is just a thought. It isn't even something that actually exists, except for within the realm of belief and thought. The body that is functioning actually does exist. The person, you could say, because or the human being, it's here. And it is functioning in life. But it is a machine functioning automatically, being lived by life based on its design and the circumstance it finds itself in. So the phone rings and automatically the body knows that this is a phone, and the indicator that says it's functioning and that someone would like to talk to us is a ring. So when it rings, the body picks it up. It's automatic. It's been programmed to do that. Just like when you talk to Siri or Alexa or whatever the different names are, and you ask them what is the time, they have been programmed to know what to do with that set of verbal instructions. So the body is functioning automatically. And then an identity belief system says, oh, I did that. And it also says, I need this, and I don't need that. It says, if you give me this, then you are loving me. You are adding to me. This is what I need in life. If you take this away from me, whatever it has on its list, you are hating me, you are attacking me. I don't need that in my life. I need to be complete. And every time you take something from me, you make me incomplete. So this psychological identity has its set of rules and needs and ideas about itself that are completely unique, but often share a common theme for all human beings. So a human being often has, it seems by default, has been grown and designed by life to include this psychological identity that has an idea about what it is. Now, the good news, ironically, the good news is this idea about what we are is completely false. The idea about what we are, which is something that requires life to be a certain way in order to one day maybe be complete. This idea that I am the one doing things, and therefore the times that things haven't worked out, basically it's my fault, and I am contributing to my lack of happiness and my lack of completeness, because those things that didn't work out because I didn't do well enough were things that I needed in order to be complete. So there is bound to be a sense of discomfort with one's imperfections, with the body's imperfections. And it's not the body that is uncomfortable with the imperfections. It's not the body that is uncomfortable with the outcomes that happened 5 years ago that were painful or not in line with the preferences. It's the psychological identity that says, actually, I needed that in order to be complete, and I don't have it because I, also including the I to be the body, didn't perform as it should, or you, the other, performed a certain way that delivered pain to me, took something I wanted away, or didn't deliver something I wanted. And so that psychological identity feels inherently uncomfortable with itself, with the other, and with life. So the good news is that that identity is based on a completely inaccurate perception of life and how life works, completely inaccurate perception about what the human being really is. It's good news because that identity creates suffering. If that identity was actually what we are, then we'd have to conclude that the suffering is part of our true nature. And then we could stop seeking for the end of suffering. Because we just realize that my nature, if that's what we really were, is to suffer. What I'm suggesting now is an identity that has been set in place that is not really what you are. An identity that drags into it the sense that this is what I am. It is that which suffers. An identity that can collapse once the beliefs at its core are seen to be false. Now there's another component in this that keeps all this in place and actually prevents the collapsing from happening. Because as part of the collapsing, we need to start experiencing ourselves outside or beyond or prior to, i.e., not identified with this psychological identity. So a shift needs to start happening, a shift outside of the belief system that creates so much uncomfortableness. And as a shift outside of that psychological identity happens, we start to experience ourselves in our potentiality. We start to understand our potentiality as humans to exist free of suffering. So as that potentiality starts to become actualized, starts to become known, then a contrast between this acceptance of life, because that's what we find our essence to be, stillness, completeness, and witnessing life, witnessing the flow of life, meaning the pleasures and pains of life, the outcomes, and not being attacked or added to or subtracted from because of the outcomes. So we start to experience ourselves as being something outside of the flow of life. And so knowing ourselves directly, such that the suffering or the pleasure and pain of life is witnessed without involvement in it. So there's two things. There's the pleasure or pain of life, and there is the suffering, which is our involvement in the pleasure and pain. If we rest fully in our essence, then the pleasures and pain of life are witnessed, and there's no involvement in there. However, there can be some remnants of the psychological identity that continue to function even when we drop into our essence. And if that's happening, then what we will witness is the pleasures and pains of life. Let's say someone sent you a hurtful message, so that is part of the flow of life. The message is hurtful, so there can be emotional pain or inconvenience. Someone might have cancelled something, so there's inconvenience pain. And the psychological identity may well get involved and create suffering. And if we are in the witnessing, there will be a witnessing of the pleasure and pain. And if the suffering is created, eventually the suffering will stop completely. And there will just be a capacity to witness life as a happening without needing to witness the involvement or the suffering, because the psychological identity will have completely atrophied, completely dissolved, once it's seen in its entirety and its structure is loosened enough and collapses. In the meantime, there is this capacity to witness, which really means a non-involvement in the suffering and the pleasure and pains of life. Now, what prevents that from starting to happen is a habit of the psychological identity to only know life through the lens of attachment, the lens of identification. Now, what identification means is it's essentially talking about the structure of the belief that says what I am requires life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. And it looks at the body and says, oh, I am that. And it knows that the body is what experiences the pleasures and pains of life. The body and the brain as part of it. So it includes the physical aspects of the body and the mental or the thought, emotion aspects of the body. So this psychological identity looks at the body and says, oh, that obviously is part of what I am. There's the identity that says, oh, and what I need is the pleasure that happens to the body to be only pleasure and no pain. And so in that identity, there is identification with the body, identification with thoughts, identification with emotions, meaning they are mine and my doing, because this psychological identity sees the body as a separate, insulated, independent entity with complete control and volition over everything that happens through it. So identification with the body and identification with outcomes, which means that whatever is happening in life is seen and judged through the filter of thought, a conceptual filter that, without us knowing it, is always judging and labeling and assessing life relative to its idea of itself. Assessing whether this that is happening is good or bad relative to the idea of itself and what it needs. It is always judging itself for having functioned well or not well, judging the other for functioning in a way that delivers pleasure or pain, judging the past as being a good version of life or a bad version of life because it came close to being my ideal or very far away from being my ideal. And it looks into the future, imagining what the future should be, and then creating a strategy based on the idea, I can make that happen. I am the controller of life. So our entire experience of life, not because we're doing it wrong, but because this identity has developed, our entire experience of life is life known through a filter of thought that creates a me that is here and an outside world that is there. The thoughts are all based on words. Words and their meanings are part of thought. So when a sentence is structured, it's a whole lot of words put into a certain structure to mean something. And so the thinking about what I need in life, the psychological thinking, is essentially all thought. And life isn't known to be available in any other experience of it than the experience that we have had from the time that language set in, and as a result of the baby or the young child starting to be able to conceptualize in the form of language. It started to be able to form this self-identity, which is why, children between the age of 2.5 and 3 start to become so problematic, because the conceptual psychological identity of who they are and what they need in life sets in. And from that point on, life is a feedback loop of assessing your external circumstance through this filter. Now, clearly, some people's filters are more dense, create more uncomfortableness than others. However, the fact is that anyone who is experiencing life through a filter is going to feel some form of uncomfortableness, because that life experience essentially keeps us disconnected from the part of ourself that is capable of living life essentially uninvolved and unattached, feeling complete and at peace, connected, regardless of the circumstance. That identity has been reinforced literally moment after moment after moment for 60 minutes an hour, 18 hours a day, or for however long we're awake in the day, for how many months, how many years we've been alive. So this way of relating to life is so automatic and the only way that exists, that when an alternative is spoken about, it sounds very good, because the description is a description that talks about the end of suffering, about peace, about non-involvement with the inevitable pleasures and pains of life, speaks about a connection to self, a knowing of oneself truly, a falling away of ignorance. So the description is all very nice and enticing, and yet we can find that there's a frustration that sets in after a while of hearing this, because even though the motivation is there, the intention is there to know life truly, to know myself, to recognize that aspect of myself that has been covered up by the false self. Even though the motivation is there, the switches may not be switched. The buttons that need to be pushed to essentially eject ourselves, or to have ourselves ejected out of this identification with the psychological identity, may not get pushed. Which means essentially what it really means, the buttons don't get pushed, means that the functioning of the psychological identity, seeing life through the lens of thought, is perpetuated, and we don't realize what action, what is happening that is actually keeping the perception of life a particular way. And in fact, the descriptions that are given can accelerate or compound or reinforce that very action of the psychological identity, which means there might be a motivation, but the actual action to try and find this shift may well be keeping the psychological identity very active. So some teachings have a very profound and powerful methodology for breaking that identification. However, there's a however. In order to break it, the information that is delivered is information specifically designed to try and break the habit of seeing life through that psychological identity. And in turn, that information, even if it succeeds, or especially if it succeeds, in flipping the movement in the opposite direction or bringing that movement to an end, can leave us with beliefs about life that have been delivered to us in order to break this identifying with life and identifying with the body, can leave us with beliefs that we don't realize are beliefs because we have trusted the teaching, which we need to. The teaching has delivered a shift that is palpable. It has delivered a shift that allows an experiencing of life to be radically different from that before. And because we have experienced a shift that we can see is highly correlated with the information that we were given, and it allows life to be experienced and felt to be very much in line, at least from a certain perspective, with the pointers given, that we have every reason to trust that they are truth. They brought about a breaking of something that we can now feel was definitely not aiding us. They brought about a connection to an aspect of the human being that wasn't seen before. And from that perspective, life is known or perceived very much in line with the descriptions given in the teaching. And so those descriptions are believed. So why I'm describing it this way is because I'm now going to talk about some of the reasoning and some of the descriptions given, which you might like to, especially if this witnessing, this acceptance, this non-involvement in the flow of life, especially if that isn't something that you are experiencing, isn't a shift that has started to happen, and as it happens more and more becomes a place where we can rest much more naturally. It's a movement that can almost seem like it's controlled by us, that we have will over it. Because it becomes so second nature. It's like a rusted handle that hadn't ever moved and it was stuck in place. And as it is moved once, it's a stiff movement. And as it's moved more and more times, the movement essentially loosens the handle up until it can move freely. So if this isn't something you've found taking place, you might be able to take some of the descriptions that I'm going to give and apply them for periods of time. I'm not going to deliver them in the same way that some other teachings deliver them, because the other teachings take a much more absolute perspective that say this is how life is. And that's why those teachings can be very effective and powerful at cracking, because they don't give any leeway. However, they can leave someone in limbo land for a long time, maybe actually forever, where the seeking doesn't become integrated. So what I've just said is definitely not a criticism of those teachings. I trust that a lot of people along their way have to and do come across those teachings and absorb them, and this shift gets put in place. And then they would come to another teaching, and what I put forward can serve as this purpose, that then refines the belief systems so that they are more useful to aid in a integrated living of life as the human being. Integrated means not forgetting that aspect that you have awoken to, but allowing it to fit into a sense of who you are that is maybe more rounded than was needed in order to bring about the awakening. So these comparisons are not in the slightest bit criticisms or suggestions that one teaching is better than the other. All the teachings actually dovetail together, take over from each other, and seekers will need to move from one to the other. And in fact, a teaching that I might say is not very well rounded doesn't mean it's not good. It means it's very focused, and a very focused teaching might be very good at breaking through a very particular shell. So at no point is the comparison there as a comparison of a good teaching versus a bad teaching. Completely not that. It's really important, because if it's heard as a comparison of a teaching being valid or not valid, then the very point of making the comparison is lost. The reason for making the comparison is to aid the working mind in understanding this psychological identity better than it did before, understanding what needs to happen and how a very focused teaching brings that about. And so this is not the topic I normally cover in the peace of mind in daily living teaching that talks about doership and attachment to outcomes in its standard form. However, I want to address it because if it's not covered, if it's not touched on, the psychological identity may continue to listen to the teachings of non-doership and non-attachment. And this shift that is actually an important shift and can happen in many different ways. So not only through the very focused teachings, it can happen in an integrating teaching. But if it doesn't happen in the integrating teaching and someone is continually listening to the integrating teaching, but a very important break hasn't happened, then once again, someone can get stuck there. So if this is introduced, anyone who has listened to the doership and attachment teachings but hasn't ever contemplated in a way that has broken this bond I'm going to speak of, maybe this discussion will help. Essentially, we are always knowing life through thought when the psychological identity is in place, because the psychological identity knows itself relative to outcomes. It's always saying, this is good for me, this is going to add to me, or this is bad for me. Which is why when things are not looking good, there is a sense of anxiety, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of worry, because the outlook isn't good. And the psychological identity says, I am being completely attacked by this potentiality of a negative outlook. It only knows itself relative to outcomes. So we are often encouraged to know life independent of labels. To see life independent of labels. That means to allow the experience of life to be there without an assessment of whether it is good or bad, whether it is acceptable or unacceptable. Now, to aid in that happening, certain descriptions about life are given. Descriptions that will undermine all of the thinking that the psychological identity, all of the thinking fundamentals that are core to the psychological thinking. So causality, for example, that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, is undermined. How does the teaching undermine it? It says life is not causal. Life is spontaneous. Life is not at all what it appears to be. There is no such thing as time. All there is what is happening right now. What you are is not a body. What you are is not a person. Life doesn't exist as pleasure or pain unless you think about it that way, unless you label it that way. And that life itself has no such distinctions of pleasure and pain. Labeling it as good or bad, this or that, is all part of the ignorance, all part of what prevents the oneness of life from being known. So don't do it. There is no such thing as the past. There is no such thing as the future. There is no such thing as pleasure or pain. There is no such thing as good or bad. There is no such thing as healthy or unhealthy. There is no such thing as hot or cold, unless you label it. You are not a body. There is no other. There isn't even a you or an I. life is an illusion of time and space. Life is an illusion of causality. Life is an illusion of me and the other. Life is an illusion of duality. Reality is the absence of separation. In reality, you are not a person. So, as I continue to describe reality and illusion, what is real and what is unreal, and as the seeker listens to that, and if there is a resonance with that, and there should be a resonance on some level, because all of those pointers are interfering with your idea of life that has been set in place for a whole lifetime, interfering with the idea of life that's been set in place for a lifetime that is the lens through which life has been seen. A lens which I'm describing as the psychological identity that suffers and feels uncomfortableness. The psychological identity that is disconnected from the true self that is complete in this very moment. So as you listen to those descriptions, a description that says what you are is invulnerable. What you are is timeless and formless. You are infinite, untouched by the flow of life. You were never born and you'll never die. It is the body that lives life for a short period of time and dies. That is not what you are. You are prior to that. Your nature is eternal and infinite. You will never die. You are not subject to birth and death. You are that which is beyond the body, beyond the illusion of life. You are that which is aware of the dream of life. Any story about being the body, any story about duality, any story about yourself and the other and what the other has done to hurt you is all a story of ignorance. It's a story of not knowing yourself. So stop it. What you really are is awareness or consciousness. That consciousness can know itself in this very moment. The awareness or consciousness that you are is that which is functioning in every moment, aware of whatever is happening. Be that consciousness. That consciousness is prior to the body. Forget the idea that you are experiencing the world through your senses. That is part of the illusion. You are not the body. Life is not recognized or awared through the senses. Awareness is aware of life directly, not from a distance. What you are is one with life. You are all pervasive. You are not a limited form. You don't have a personality. You are not the body. You are that which is aware of the body. That which witnesses the thoughts arising, the emotions arising, the feelings arising. You are that which witnesses the body moving. And awareness can only know itself by itself. Awareness is never going to know itself through the process of thinking. Thinking is the problem. Your true state is a state of no mind. Liberation is the end of identifying yourself as the body. It's the end of identifying yourself as thoughts, as emotions, as feelings. Liberation is to know yourself as the formless awareness in which the whole universe arises, in which the dream of life, an appearance in consciousness, comes and goes. The present moment spontaneously arises and collapses, arises and collapses, and what you are is that which remains unchanged, that which doesn't move, that which witnesses the coming and going of all of the phenomenal content. What you are is present even in deep sleep, aware of nothing. You exist prior to any idea of yourself. You exist prior to any thoughts of what you need and what you don't need. You exist prior and independent of any ideas of what the other has done to you or can do to you, what life circumstance will mean about who you are. You are that which is aware of the thinking. You are that which is aware of this idea of being a person. Should all thinking stop, what you are will remain pristine and ever present. The silent witness of the thinking or the absence of the thinking. Remain as that and know yourself truly. To know yourself through sensations, to know yourself through thought, to know yourself through ideas of the past and the future, to have an idea of yourself in relation to what governments are doing, what society is doing to the environment, is to not know yourself. Be the silent witness to everything that happens, including the thinking, the emotions, the body. You will never know yourself through thought. You will never know life truly through the lens of thought. Allow what is here right now to be witnessed prior to any thinking about it. And realize that what you are as awareness is always aware of what is right here. In one of Rumi's poems, he says, "There is a field. I'll meet you there." Now this field is the field of awareness, the field of consciousness that we all are. The field of consciousness prior to the body. prior to thinking of oneself as the body or the thoughts or the feelings or the emotions. When the soul lies down in the grass of that field, beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing. So it means witnessing any ideas of this is how it should be, this is how it shouldn't be, this is good, this is bad, I did this, I did that. When the soul lies down in the grass beyond the ideas of right knowing, right doing or wrong doing. So I might have some of the words wrong. I haven't read the poem for many years. But the sentiment is exactly this: to know yourself outside of any definition of yourself. That is when we feel too full to even speak. This is the self that is not interested in being defined by debates of what is right and wrong. It is the self that is not interested in being defined as a body, as a personality. And it's the self that exists outside of the realm or the dimension of thought. On the realm that is aware and witnesses thought arise out of nothing and subside back into nothing. It is a realm or dimension prior to the body. A realm or dimension that witnesses the body as an object, not the subject. It is a realm where you know yourself directly as formless and infinite and eternal. The realm where you know yourself as infinite, because the thinking that is so good at collapsing the infinite that we are down onto the realm of relativity and limitation is not there. So all of those descriptions about who you are and what life really is are there to interfere with the attachment to outcomes, the identification with the body, the identification with thought that says what I am is this and what I need is that, and your actions are an attack on who I am. Know yourself outside of thought, where you can just be prior to any thinking. And as you are being this silent witnessing, notice that the content of life is always here within the field of awareness that you are. And it doesn't require any thinking to define it in order to bring it into existence. It is here prior to being labeled, prior to being considered as something that defines who you are. So as you go through your life, day after day after day, repeating, reminding yourself about all of the pointers that have been put forward as a cutting off of the narrative that describes yourself as something defined by the physical form, something defined by thought. As that gets cut off, you might find yourself resting in a dimension of pure witnessing awareness, knowing yourself prior to the body, knowing yourself as that in which the whole experience of life arises, realizing that there really is no past and future. There is only the ever-present moment arising, and there is no such thing as duality. No pleasure, no pain, unless the thinking mind comes in and labels it. Unless the psychological self comes in and says this is good and that is bad. And that is duality, that is ignorance. That is what prevents the oneness of life from being known. That is what prevents the realization of the non-dual reality. So abide there often. Abide there for your whole life. It's your true nature. It's effortless. It doesn't require you to do anything. What you are is formless awareness, and the very nature of formless awareness is to be aware, to witness. It is not something you need to do. It is what is always functioning prior to any thought. Completely natural, effortless, ever present. Has always been there and will always be there. Only ever known right now. So let's see if we have any hands up. We've got Walter. Hello, Walter. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Walter?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Great. Fantastic talk. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. guess at first, in the beginning, when you were talking, you talked about a shift outside the belief system, and you talked about witnessing. And this, something happened here where that witnessing took place. And I saw thoughts happening, everything happening, just as you described. And it was like a detachment. You know, prior to that, I had been fully identified with my thoughts and everything that was going on. It was like my thoughts, and I'm thinking them. And so when this happened, I just saw the thoughts kind of just going on by themselves, independently, without, as you would say, without a door. And then I really started to understand why people say there's no free will and volition, because I saw essentially that there wasn't a me.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think if it's seen through, if the me is seen through, then everything else sort of is almost obvious. Because if there's no you, then how is there free will? There would need to be someone to have the volition and free will. So anyway, the teachings became very clear in that moment, and that there is no individual separate entity with free will and choice and all these things. So, but then after that, obviously the thinking continued, and although there was a shift in my belief system, as you say, I still witnessed the thoughts of I shouldn't be doing this, I shouldn't be doing that, and you almost described a process in which the old ways of thinking and attachment to outcome should naturally dissipate after seeing these things that I described. And that never really happened. You know, I still see myself in a position where I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't. And I am attached to outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this piece in daily living that you talk about, I can't say it really materialized. But what I can say is it went from an intellectual understanding to an experiential understanding, which was a big shift, but it didn't quite bring to fruit all these things that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And also, the shift, a lot of people talk about the shift in identity from I am a person, I'm a body, mind, organism, to I am awareness. But that never really happened either. I kind of saw this absolute, there is awareness, there is consciousness. I never saw that I am those things. I just saw that everything just is.
Mm-hmm.
I never grasped, I said, oh, that's me, that's my identity. I never, you know, my identity almost completely vanished, and I never identified with awareness or consciousness or any of these words. I just saw that everything just is. Like everything is just happening, including my thoughts about I should or shouldn't do this.
Mm-hmm. And where was that? Where was that registered from? What aspect of the present moment, let's say, what aspect of what's here now was aware of all of that?
You asked me what was aware of everything?
Yeah, everything as a happening, seeing the thoughts arising and floating past, or however. So what was registering all of that? Like, was it Walter? Was it Walter's thinking, or was it Walter the person, or was it something much less personal than there? So there isn't. I'm not trying to lead you somewhere. I'm like really interested because the experience can manifest differently for in many different ways for different people. So I'm really interested in exactly how the experience was constructed for you. And I know you're having to sort of just rely on memory of the experience. But maybe you can answer that question.
Well, it sounds like the answer would be consciousness is registering those things.
Well, there isn't a right answer. What I'm saying is that in the moment, what was it? Like, what did it feel like to you?
It felt like just a pure observing, or I like your word witness, seeing, cognizing, just like seeing things as they are
Mm-hmm.
without a seer, just like, oh, that's, it was like a moment, was like, wow, that's what they've been talking about all this time,
Right. Okay.
so it was, yeah.
So there wasn't a witnesser. There was just witnessing, right? Just witnessing happening.
Yeah, I didn't like figure this out, but it was just like revealed.
Mm-hmm.
I had nothing to do with it.
Indeed.
Well, I had nothing to do with anything, really, as you know. I mean, so I guess what I'm getting at is this whole piece in daily living through detachment to outcome, and a recognition that no one is doing anything. Everything is just a happening. And everything, because I've been listening to a lot lately, is just according to my programming and up-to-date conditioning. And whatever this uniquely designed robot is programmed and destined to do, that's what's going to happen.
Right.
Even sort of, now that I feel like that's all been more understood up here and less experientially.
Well, okay. So let me clarify a couple of things. What I said today is not the typical teaching, right? What I was trying to hammer home today is the fact that if we've never heard, because we haven't been exposed to a very specific teaching that says what you are is prior to thought, prior to thinking, then essentially we won't have any experience of knowing ourselves outside of the realm of thought. What's a little tricky is now that what you're describing is an awakening experience, right? Where for a moment, let's say, I don't know how long it was, life was known from essentially a place out of thinking, out of at least the thinking that creates the limited sense of self that can't see life as a happening. So that happened, but I'm not sure what preceded it for you. Often what will precede something like that is where the thinking is being starved. So any thinking is being starved by the seeker, essentially. So the seeker has been primed to know that life can only be known truly from prior to the lens of thinking. And if a seeker has been primed with new conditioning, essentially. And then if that seeker interacts with the teacher and they bring in concepts, if they try to talk about life as if it is causal, as if they are a body, the teacher essentially is going to remind them that they are lost in their idea of themselves, their idea of life, and just come back to this simplicity that's here right now. So all of the questions about what isn't known and how do I get to know it, and this is what happened to me in the past, is all based on this false and illusory perception of life, right? That's what a teaching will encourage, because if we're lost in thinking, if we're lost in trying to get somewhere and trying to understand things through our thinking, which is, how we often will engage in seeking, the teacher is doing us a favor by trying to snap us out of that mode of functioning in life. It's the mode that I mentioned we've spent our whole life functioning in, believing ourselves to be a thought-based identity, without realizing that we think we're a thought-based identity, because that thought-based identity creates a very concrete sense of self. And so the teaching is trying to get us to snap out of that habit. And we don't necessarily snap out of it in that very moment. If we did, it would be very convenient, right? You just go to one satsang that says that and you snap out of it. And if you just snapped out of it and stayed out of it, then, that's in a way fantastic. But what it often requires is a prolonged effort on behalf of the seeker to interfere with the thinking that has become so habitual. So whenever there is a thought about anything, actually, any type of thinking, in the particular teaching or path that I'm speaking about specifically today, it will encourage the seeker to not think about anything. That all thinking is based, is the false sense of self, the false idea of yourself. It's the lens through which non-duality is not known, right? And so, in a way, I'm a little reluctant in this satsang to go back to describing life causally and as I normally would, because I may not be hammering home the fact that this movement to know life prior to thinking on a sustained basis as part of one's seeking, so to literally move through your day interfering with any thinking that arises. What I mean by interfering is to catch it, to see it and go, oh, there it is again. I'm the happening where I know myself as this psychological identity is happening again. And that recognition of the thinking, and hopefully finding a place where the thinking can just stop even for a second, is that teaching working? Is that teaching doing its job? Now, it might require someone to be vigilant in this regard for 6 months. Every day, all day, or at least whenever it's possible, to interfere with the story of being a person. And that motivation, which really comes when the seeker has been exposed to the teaching that says, anything other than that is illusion. Do you want to remain stuck in illusion, or do you want to know yourself truly? So as that is practiced, which really means just an awareness of whenever the thinking happens, will create a weakening of that thinking dynamic. Right? So before I go on to addressing what you're talking about in a more conceptual way, which is essentially the exact opposite of what I'm trying to point out in this satsang, I really want to hammer home that for anyone listening who finds there is no space, there is no dropping into a sense of what I am is not the doer, a cutting off of the thinking mind. If that hasn't happened, and there's a feeling of frustration that the thinking just seems to keep winning the day, then this complete negation of any thinking. Obviously not with more thinking. You can't negate thinking by thinking. It needs to be a recognition. So the recognition can include thinking, like, oh, there it is again. And that thought, there it is again, hopefully acts as a sort of a knife that cuts the thought off and allows us to focus on the present moment without needing to think about it, which really means, because when we're thinking about anything, usually something we need in the future or whatever, or what someone said to us, we're not really present with what's happening right now. So the simple movement of, oh, there it is, and bringing your attention to the walls and the people, the television set, even what's on television. If you are being really present with just the images, your attention has dropped out of thinking into presence. Does that make sense?
Yes, it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, that I should make a conscious effort to return to this as often as possible. When initially it just happened spontaneously without any thought or effort, but now I can almost use that as a practice to continually come back to presence.
That's right, because the fact that this has happened is largely irrelevant in a way, unless it allows for a movement back to that space to happen effortlessly, or allows that space to remain there. Whereas what normally happens is someone has a spontaneous awakening. It's like, wow, what's this? What's happened? And then it fades away and we go back to largely knowing life and knowing ourselves how we always have. And there are a lot of people that, and I'm not saying you fit into this category, you haven't exhibited or said anything that makes me think this is the case for you, but there are a lot of people that say, oh, I had an awakening back in 1987. And it's important to them for whatever reason. Whereas if it happened and then it faded away, the actual happening of an awakening where it fades away and doesn't leave anything behind, doesn't make a practical change, is not sort of anything of great value. Whereas I think some people relate to it as, because it's described as, let's say, awakening and enlightenment, whatever. So then they sort of hold on to the remnants of it, or the fact it happened, and want that to be important. What's important is if you're able to find that sense of self, or that aspect of self, and know it directly rather than, having a memory of it. Now, where it does serve a purpose for it to happen spontaneously and then fade away is it shows you that there is something different that's available because it's happened. And so what you said in response to my answer is exactly right. Is what I'm suggesting is it can become a practice, but not a practice that a doer is trying to do to achieve something, but rather a recognition, a spontaneous recognition from the system itself, just because the system has been given the information that any thinking about being a person, about good and bad, about seeing life and labeling life is all based on ignorance or the seeing of life as duality. And so if the system has been primed with that, then it can be an automatic practice that happens on its own. So it's not a practice you do for an hour in the morning or whatever. It's you just live life, and whenever the thinking is happening, a sword thought can come up and go, there it is again, stop, come back to knowing yourself not as a person. What I mean is not as a person, not as the idea of a person that needs this and that and existed in the past and will be in the future, and how I wonder how it's going to be and why aren't things working out. So come and know yourself outside of that narrative, which becomes more and more available as that thinking, any thinking, gets cut off.
Perfect sense. I guess my misunderstanding was that it was like a spiritual lottery, and if this thing happened, that was it.
Hmm.
You know? And, like, I didn't realize that perhaps there would be more practices to do, or more investigating. But I appreciate that, and I can see that that's true because I've been doing that and just observing, like, wow, this thought, I should have done that differently, or I could do this better. These thoughts keep popping up, and I guess you answered my question, but I was just wondering why they were still coming up, even in spite of seeing through the illusion, and even though these concepts have been clearly seen or understood, I thought that just naturally these other things would fall away after that. Somebody described it as unplugging a fan, but it still kind of spins for a little while after you unplug it.
Yeah. Yeah,
I realize that thing is not going to stop spinning unless I do what you're saying. I just thought it would stop spinning on its own.
It can if the groundedness into that space remains, but often it doesn't, and so then there needs to be a sort of a reminder to drop back into that space, and that can be very hard if we haven't realized that it's the thinking that keeps us out of that space, because we then might hear drop back in the space, and then the thinking tries to drop into the space. It says, okay, Roger told me to do this. Now, I forget what he told me to do, but anyway, my job is to drop back into the space. And we need to realize it's the thinking that is keeping us out of the space. So it isn't really a practice for Walter to do. It's just a movement of Walter that hopefully can get a sense that Walter exists, the essence of Walter exists prior to thinking. And the more often that Walter is interested in being free of thought, meaning, Walter starts to realize that the thought is really a waste of energy. It's not taking you anywhere. It's not adding anything to you. In fact, it's what keeps you disconnected from that space. The more the system knows that, the more frequently it's going to be disinterested in thought. In fact, it's going to be actively, at least in theory, knowing it exists outside of thinking. And that, if you try it for a week, or allow that, not really try it, if you allow that movement of cutting off thoughts to happen for a week, you might notice something change.
Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Who is it? Okay. Hello, Holger.
Hello. No real question. To know when enough is enough. I mean, when enough thinking is there, and just to be in this field without the question then. So what's next? I mean, just to rest there and I don't know even what to say, because the thinking is never ending. I mean, it's
Yeah, I agree. So, in like Walter mentioned, this analogy of the fan being unplugged. To me, the fan being unplugged is this recognizing that the question is in itself part of the problem. The question, any question really about when will it end, when is enough. If we are fortunate to realize that is what keeps the seeking going, and to move our attention in another direction, let's say, a direction that is not interested in asking those questions, because we understand that those questions will never end. So there is a beautiful recognition, which is, as understanding deepens, it's not about getting answers to questions, but rather it's about the questions falling away.
Yeah, there's just such a deep-rooted mechanism inside of my thinking that I'm just so afraid of losing this instrument. I mean, like I would need to do something in order to keep myself alive.
That is the identity, right? That the teachings are trying to say. You can keep living there if you want, but that is the place where you don't know yourself.
Yeah.
But
for me, this dropping into this place is just like to feel myself in the back of my head. I mean, this is for me like an access point to get to this field, because it's always there. It's just dropping away of my normal functioning. It's just so beautiful how you describe all the things. It makes so much sense. It's so pristine and delicious just to listen to you. It just pushes so many. It's such a freedom just without.
Do you find a little? Do you find a little smile come on your face when you drop there? Drop into that place of being?
Once in a while
Because that's what starts to give us the courage, essentially, to let go of the thinking. Because if we can drop into that place that feels so sweet and have a little smile come onto our face, which is here is the pure being that I am, and it's, in a way, it's so simple, but it's so full. And if we can know that that is outside of the thinking, then, you know, that can be very encouraging to us to sort of break up with the thinking, because we're not really losing so much. But it's also important to note that, you know, if the doer tries to do this, the doer is more thinking. So even if we see the doer trying to stop thinking, we need to hopefully find a movement happening that drops out of that thinking as well. Yeah. So even the thinking that is trying to stop thinking, we are prior to that.
Something is can be shaking, just on a very subtle level, but yes, I hear you. I had, when I could talk forever, but I don't really want to. I had many years ago, and I don't want to, I had just an experience. I was riding my bike, and I don't know what happened, but I had everything opened up, and it felt so wonderful and amazing. And then I just direct closed down and said, oh, I'm afraid of it. It's too beautiful. And it was maybe 30 years ago or something, and I haven't thought about it for a long time. But
yeah, maybe, you know.
Anyway, thank you so much. It will all come because it's already here.
Yes, yeah. I was just going to say, with that experience, maybe we don't think we deserve it, you know? There's a part of the psychological identity is so convinced that it doesn't maybe deserve much in life.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Thank you, Holger.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Jared.
Hello, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I hear you.
So I put my video on. Okay. So can you see me now?
Yes.
Okay. So hello again.
Hello, Jaroslav.
It was very lovely. Your talk, your guided meditation. You bring us liberation. Now I feel a little bit stress in my stomach, a little bit because of talking to you now. But so I'm very grateful for your teaching, for your big heart, and such wonderful integrated being, so humble. So I'm grateful, and you bring peace. You expect being with you is just, you don't need to make questions. Just be, enjoy this, and as you said, trying to meet this place more and more and grounding yourself in this. So yes, and it's part of me that wants to prepare some question to you. So this is also wants also to come in. Yes, so maybe I started. So for me, what was difficult to, because of my whole positive attitude, to let come fully to my body, because I was afraid, because I have some traumatic experience, some I think just bothered mind, some bad happening,
Mm-hmm.
and he was afraid that to be erased, like some tornado, and like instead like can be like finished so quickly. So this was like the part who was wanted to think, to not to die, to have some strategies, but he was believing to be here to stay alive. So to dissolve this, it's challenging, but I think you helped me in this path. So thank you one more time. And so, how are you, Roger?
I'm very well. Very well, Jaroslav. I can comment something small on what you've just said. The the traumas in your body, if we meet them, they will have in them a sense of this is going to kill me, because usually in traumas, in a mild way or an extreme way, the sense is this is an attack on my being or my life. So it inherently, all suffering at the bottom of it is a fear of dying, a fear of not existing. And so when you meet that trauma and it starts to intensify, the sense is this is going to kill me. So we very quickly just move away in the other direction. It's an intuitive movement away from the feeling this will kill me. Now, if we keep moving in the direction away from it, we don't ever really get to meet it. So what I'm suggesting here is that the feeling that says this will kill me is not truth. So maybe a part of you can say, actually, this feeling cannot possibly kill me, right? Even if it gets very, very intense, it doesn't have the capacity to kill you. It will feel like it's killing you or like it will kill you. But if there is a part of you that can understand this feeling, just like a thought, can't kill me, so it is safe to let it get bigger. We've spent our whole life moving away from it, thinking, believing that if I feel this, because inherently in the feeling there's a feeling of uncomfortableness that I am saying ultimately is a fear of death, we've believed that, and it's moved us in the other direction, into distraction and suppression techniques and defenses. So our system at some point needs to be equipped with the understanding this feeling, intense as it is, can never touch me, can never kill me. And that can give us the motivation to feel something that ordinarily we will, all parts of our body will move away from, or all parts of our system will ordinarily move away from it. And so what I'm saying hopefully will be some weight towards moving towards it.
Yes. Thank you for your suggestion and clues.
Mm-hmm.
It's not difficult. It's not easy many times to just stop and do nothing, because the mind wants his own idea, which is like better. It's not easy, and it's frightening, because this is like, because what about like brutal attack on the body, like somebody want to like kick you or hit you, and you like need to react to make defense. So this is like, don't trust this like when there is what is like dissolve this, to see this reaction, to like put.
Yeah, well, in those situations, maybe don't practice this do nothing. But in moments where there isn't a physical danger to you, then you'll see what harm can happen to just stop. That part of the thinking will come up with all sorts of excuses, saying, but what about if I stop in this other situation? I say, oh, don't worry about that other situation. Do it when it's easy to stop and there's no problem. When you're sitting on the couch on your own, just instead of entertaining the thinking, just realize, stop. Stop the thinking and just be. And if that happens 3 times for a second in a day, that is a huge improvement compared to if it hasn't happened much in the last 20 years. So if we find that it happens just for 3 times in a day, for 3 weeks in a row, that might be a very, very big shift.
Yes. I have some because in my child I was like good pupil. I was hard learning in school, read a lot of books to be a better child, to have success, to my parents, society loves me. So this was the good boy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I met my uncle, and I wanted to I remember I was going to church, and the Christian figure of Jesus Christ was for me the model of because I didn't have many role model from the man in my young childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Christ was right for me, but I was not agree with because I wanted to expect it from Christ to heal my eyes, my vision, because I wanted to be have health, and as you said, in the so I was not agreeing with society to go into operation, because I wanted to from my natural resources, because sometimes when I was teaching math and I had good interaction, my vision was better, but it was not so stable, like sinusoidal, so it was difficult. So, but I finally go to lesser operations, so now my vision is good, but to be honest, I am trying to live now with this some kind of. I don't feel I think a little bit maybe tension, block in this area, because maybe this is not super nature, natural thing to be operated, but as you said, now I'm in process to just accept this is my destiny. So yes, so maybe you have some thoughts for this what I said now.
Yes, don't we don't understand the complexity of the universe. It is far too vast for our human brain to understand, and so coming up with these ideas of what is natural and what is not natural is really just a overlooking of the fact that the universe is so complex, so vast, that we can't possibly know the laws of the universe. And if we are worried about what is natural and unnatural, it's really our thinking saying, I do understand the laws of the universe.
So you said that the physician or so which they science tell us that there is some basic laws to the physics, like some cosmic constants. So are you suggesting that this exists because we like believe this, or it doesn't like be here? It don't should like it's like optional.
No, I'm saying that your idea of what is right and wrong in the universe, what is natural and unnatural, that is the idea of a brain that can't possibly understand the laws of the universe. So if you're worrying about having done something that's not natural, what I'm saying is let go of that idea of what is good and what is bad, what is natural and what is unnatural. And if that idea of what is natural and unnatural falls away, you'll find that your stress about the operation, for example, having done the eye operation, can fall away with it, because the stress is there because you have a belief, you have an opinion that says, I know what is natural and what is not natural. What I'm saying is that Jaroslaw and Roger can't know the complexity of the universe, so we can't come up with a conclusion of what is right and what is wrong.
Thank you, Roger. You can call me Jarek. I shortened my name because Jaroslav is maybe for English man like difficult to pronounce it. So this Polish way. So don't worry, just Jarek was really nice. Roger, so my question now is maybe some difficult one about sex, because there was like in our society like the movement on freeing like our sexuality, like the commercial, it's all about like they show us like, come on, take pleasure from like, or it's like from the pleasure which body can give you. So I must say that I was in this area also. So I experiment like I had my own way, but yes, it's like body can give you pleasure experiences, but this is not like lasting from my side, and there's no. But because in some like spiritual like teaching, there are some like suggest to okay go like celibacy is good, but some it's like tantra, they like highlight sensuality. So and so I ask you, are you like in your preference, in your opinion, from your own side, you are for free sex like before marriage? Because as a man, sometimes I have my urges like I want to like this body like organism when you see the female or sometimes it's like I know this is like natural. I try to like not like putting opinion, because just to maybe as you now suggesting come to this place and maybe don't think so much.
Exactly. If you're not hurting someone, I don't subscribe to religious beliefs that say you shouldn't, do this and that. I put forward the general attitude, which is in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do, understanding that what it is you do is part of your destiny, part of God's will. There will be consequences to what you do, and you will learn from those consequences. But the idea of I should and I shouldn't do this because I have been told or because God will judge me, especially the part of God will judge me. Whatever you do is God's will, right? I don't suggest that you hurt someone. But when it comes to your own preferences, especially if it's something independent of other people, I definitely don't say that there are shoulds and shouldn'ts. And if there are other people, involved and it's consensual, then as long as everyone is aware of how they feel about what they're doing, then they will adjust and do it again or not do it again. So I think this definitely dropping your idea of what is good and what is bad will be helpful, because in doing that, you'll find that you won't suddenly become irresponsible and stupid. You drop your ideas of what is good and what is bad, what you should and what you shouldn't do, and then your biological entity will be able to function much more independent of the psychological identity. And a lot of our human dysfunction is actually the psychological identity trying to have an outlet, because it's all suppressed in the system. And so once we drop the shoulds and shouldn'ts, you might find that there could be a period when your actions are being driven by suppressed psychological energies. But once that's been given its space, we'll find that our biological urges will tend to become much more harmonized and balanced and natural biological movements, as opposed to being driven by the psychological identity. For as long as we keep the shoulds and shouldn'ts in place, and we keep feeling this load of shame towards what we're doing and judgment towards the other, we're essentially reinforcing the psychological identity, and that, is going to find its way of controlling us and driving us. So the irony is, all of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, we might think that they're leading us to better, functioning. But my suggestion is that it is actually reinforcing the psychological uncomfortableness that prevents us from functioning in line with a natural biology that is really going to be quite healthy in its expression.
Yes, I'm learning from you to give myself maybe more time to relax, because I can say that I was working like crazy, always challenging this body and what's the limit, and it's not so good.
No.
And I can see from to the other also, because the tension which I bring in this manner, I think the others feel also. So you need to have compassion for you. But it's happening naturally when you see this, I think. But it's good to talk anyway in this manner.
Thank you.
Yes. So yes. Roger?
Yes.
So what about postpone gratification, this idea? You don't worry about this, or it's for you it's some good idea to postpone gratification, postpone, for the psychological.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a renunciation you're talking about, right?
Yes, I think so. So this is talking. So not take maybe all the time. When I want chocolate, I it's
Yeah. Postponing pleasure, or not indulging in all of the pleasures that are available. So, in a way, the opposite of your previous question. So my answer to your previous question was, drop your shoulds and shouldn'ts and allow yourself to move according to what you feel like doing. There is place in the spiritual search where we understand that my happiness, my completeness is not to be found in pleasure, that my true self exists outside of pleasure. And if we realize that our identity is so attached to pleasure, and every time we engage in pleasure, we're actually reinforcing this idea that what I am is only complete if I add more pleasure in. So somewhere in the process, it is valid for us to say, oh, actually, I'm not going to keep reinforcing this identity by having these pleasures, and so I'm going to renounce pleasures for a while. And in renouncing pleasures, you might find that you're surprised at how the urge for them can fall away after a while, and that you might start to realize, oh, I exist, I am, even if I'm not having hot showers, even if I'm not having chocolate. You might find this place of being able to rest in being, especially if you drop out of the mind that is saying, oh, I really want to have chocolate, why am I not having chocolate? If you just drop into being, after a week of not having chocolate, you might go, wow, I still exist, I'm here, and I haven't had chocolate. So then you know from your own experience that without hot showers, without chocolate, without sex, I exist. And that starts to become a proof that what you are is not dependent on pleasure. So then once the attachment is broken, you can go back to having those pleasures, but you'll go back to them with a different relationship to what you had before you renounced the pleasures for some period of time. And on occasion, when maybe you go to a hotel somewhere in the world and the hot water isn't working, you might know, actually, this is part of the pleasure and pain of life, and I exist, I can survive, and I can be happy even when the shower doesn't have hot water. Whereas if we haven't experimented with this, we don't know that we exist, even without hot showers. And so our identity and our attachment to everything being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure remains there. And then we find that the room doesn't have hot water, and we feel like, this is just not acceptable. How can this be? So I hope that has answered your questions.
Yeah, of course. Yes, when I listen to you, Roger, it's such grace from God, from our being, to be with this moment, just to be with what's brink now. So when it's brink like not hot water, I'm okay with this.
Yes.
Like seeing that this is the part, like this is meant to be, but it's not like, okay, so now I have no shower for like 2 weeks. No, you want, like, you can call, like, you can do something, but it's like more easy way, not maybe like putting fight away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes.
That's
so,
it.
Roger, next question is about heaven and hell.
Let's heaven and hell. That's too big a question for 11 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock at night for me. I think we have to wrap it up till next time.
I haven't known that in your area is this time. In Poland we have like now 4 o'clock maybe. So yes, thank you, Roger, for today. And may I call you like next time to like answer, put my
Yes, sure.
to you?
Yes.
Yes. So peace to you. Bye.
Thank you, Jack. Bye. So, thank you for joining me, everyone. Remember, what you are exists prior to all of the thinking about what we need and how we imagine ourselves, and prior to any thinking about past and future.